I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week, my guest is Victoria Moul, the author of the Substack newsletter Horace and Friends. I learned about Victoria from Joshua Meakin, who sent an article of hers to Alice and me, and we just really enjoyed it and read a few articles of hers and thought we would give her a call and see if she wanted to talk a little bit. So she is extremely learned in ways that are very gratifying. She's actually, I think, a really good follow-up to my conversation with Chris Childers. The first article we talk about, and the one that Josh sent us initially, is called "What is a Poetry Magazine For?" And you are in Paris and you have like a big family, yeah?
I've got 3 sons, 3 boys.
That sounds like I have 2 daughters, and that feels like a lot to me already. So, yeah.
Hopefully none of them will make an unexpected appearance.
No, that'd be good. That's what we live for that.
Yeah.
What's it like moving 3 boys to a new country?
We moved the older 2. The older 2 are 9 and 11, and we moved nearly 3 years ago. So they were 6 and 8. Is that right? Yeah, 6 and 8 when we moved. So that was a big deal. We came initially for a year. That was the idea. We were supposed to come for a year. And then that became 2 years, and then we've ended up staying. But the youngest, Daniel, is only 2, so he was born here.
Okay.
So his experience will be very different. It'll kind of be the other way around from the older boys in London.
Alicia Stallings, the poet, has written about like moving temporarily to Greece, 20 years ago, finding that she's suddenly, that's her home now.
I think it's a permanent move now. Yeah, I've just resigned from my professorship in London, so.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so you can say whatever you want here.
I can say whatever I want. No, it has been it's been worryingly liberating, more liberating than I expected. And it's a bit worrying that it shouldn't be, I think academics should be able to speak kind of reasonably freely, but I have definitely felt more able to say what I think. I've been on unpaid leave this year, so I sort of have effectively been semi-distanced for a while, but I am fully resigning, yeah.
We are, later on I wanted to ask, but because Alice and I are both very much admirers of like enthusiastic dilettantes of Horace. So at some point I want to get some real knowledge from you, but I'm curious because
I feel like dilettante is very generous on my.
We're enthusiastic, but we're very ignorant. But neither of us is an academic, so I'm just sort of curious, like, in what way do you feel freer, or were you less free to say what you think?
I think it's I'm sure probably less than in the States, or at least differently in the States, but to some extent in the UK, the kind of small p political atmosphere in higher education has become quite constrained. I don't want to exaggerate it at all.
Sure.
I'm not saying that there's a political monoculture or anything like that. I have, colleagues of a whole range of views. And in any case, we're British, so we don't really talk about our political views. But there has been a kind of constraint, I think, in sort of public speech, much more generally, not just in higher education, which I think a lot of people have felt. I think you feel it more as a woman, especially a woman with any kind of like social media profile in your own name. You don't have to put your head far above the parapet to get people going for you.
Is that why Substack then? Because I noticed like your readers are so engaged and polite. Like they're so nice.
Yes,
like please come and listen to my show.
Yeah, Substack is nice. It still is nice. The kind of the nasty stuff tends to happen more on like Twitter or whatever. Substack is quite civilized. And as I say, I don't want to exaggerate any of this. I don't have a very big public profile, I never had problems really saying what I thought as an academic. But I do think there is a kind of I think that the sense of constraint around teaching has changed just in the course of my career. So just in the last sort of 20 years, say. That I've been teaching in higher education. I think it's probably partly, a lot of it's to do with online life. No, it's to do with, classes being recorded and just a sort of shift in the way that public speech happens generally, but also maybe in the UK, there's a sort of specific context because of the changing kind of landscape in higher education generally. The introduction of fees and the sort of repercussions of that for the changing sense of the relationship of the contract between teachers and students.
One of my neighbors here is a Londoner, and he talked about because I think he went to some university in London as an undergrad, and then for his graduate degree he went to, I think, Oxford. But he said that there has been this radical change in how education is funded over there, and this is I mean, we are barbarians over here, and everything is totally mercenary. But I actually don't quite know what this is. When you say that the addition of fees has changed how people approach education, I actually don't totally know what that is. Is there?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
higher education was completely free. And in fact, I think I was the last year. So I went up to university in 1997. I think that was the last year not to pay any fees. And the following year, they introduced a sort of a fairly token fee, so a kind of £1,000 or something a year. So not dissimilar actually to how it works in a lot of continental Europe, where there is some sort of tuition fee, but it's fairly token. And then a few years later, I don't know, it's about 10 years ago now, I suppose, they introduced a much higher fee, so about £9,000, which hasn't really been raised since then. So the students, and then of course they have to pay to live and all the rest of it on top of that. So the students are now paying quite a lot of money and getting into quite a lot of debt, but at the same time, the fee hasn't been increased for a really long time now, for over 10 years, which means that the universities obviously are in trouble financially because there's been very significant inflation since then. So there's a rather unsatisfactory situation where, you know, students feel that they're paying a lot, and the actual financial situation and therefore the kind of conditions for universities have been being increasingly squeezed. So the whole situation.
And then the students become like the customer.
Yeah, exactly. The students become
the
customer, precisely. And it does change the dynamic. And I'm not dogmatic about this at all. I actually wasn't. A lot of my colleagues and friends were very much against the introduction of tuition fees. They thought it would ruin the sector. And actually the way it was done, they were right. They were quite right. I wasn't against it in principle, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong if you're going to have a very significant lifetime benefit from it to pay for it. I thought it should have been kind of means tested in a different way. But I'm going to be honest, I didn't think it would necessarily ruin the sector. But actually, yeah, basically it has in lots of meaningful ways. It has, partly because it's been actually inadequately funded. So lots of universities now are reliant on international fee income. I mean, there's lots of sort of, essentially quite boring technicalities, but UK universities are in trouble. That's the bottom line at the moment.
And it's changed the way
that has meant that there's been a kind of, a sense of sort of strain and contraction in the sector as a whole, I think, for a while.
So you sounds like there are a few reasons you're somewhat relieved to escape.
Yeah, I really don't want to sound too negative, because I've been very lucky with the jobs that I've had, and the job that I'm leaving is a great job, perfect job for me really, at UCL, University College London, a joint appointment between English and classics, which is exactly, suits me exactly. So these larger issues are true of the sector as a whole and make it a kind of a somewhat depressing sector to be in, but my actual little berth in it was very comfortable and to some extent protected from a lot of those pressures. But so yeah, it's mainly the sort of personal circumstances of our family move that have precipitated at least my departure.
And you're also it's a very brief note in one of the essays of yours that I read, but you are, in addition to being a reader and teacher and critic, you are now writing poems yourself.
Yeah, I do write poems, and I have published a few, and there are some forthcoming as well. I started writing poetry very late, as opposed to reading it. So I did write poems as a teenager, like everyone does. But then I stopped writing poems and only started writing poems again of my own really very recently, a few years ago, which is, I guess, a slightly unusual trajectory and certainly quite different. I think a lot of, maybe it's something to do with how writing or creative writing is taught, but I see actually these days quite a lot of young poets who sort of start off as poets and then move away from it actually. Whereas I guess, yeah, it took me a long time to come to it or come back to it, but I've always been a very enthusiastic reader of poetry.
If it's
and
not
poetry is the common. I've worked on quite a lot of disparate. I've had an unusually disparate career, kind of academically, and the one common thread is poetry. I've always worked on poetry.
I'm just curious because you know, as you mentioned in the same essay, like it is pretty uncommon today for a reader, particularly of contemporary poetry, to be really a dedicated reader who is a reader first. Even, you know, set aside whether you write poems at all, even just to be primarily a reader is unusual. If it's not too personal, I'm just sort of curious what, like Alice and I have talked about exactly the phenomenon you mentioned a moment ago, which is falling out of love with poetry. My wife is, you know, writes fiction now. We met in a poetry program and she has sworn off poetry. Really, it's, you know, soured on it. I'm curious for you, what turned that you got you to start writing it?
Well, what actually happened is that I took a week off. So the two older boys were quite little. It was a few years ago. I guess it was probably just before the pandemic. And I took a week off when we weren't going away on holiday. So I just thought, you know how relentless, I guess you probably know how relentless it is with little kids and when you're working full time. And I just thought I'm going to have a week when we're not going away and the kids are in, you know, school and childcare. I'm just going to have a week for myself. And, you know, I went to a couple of galleries and sort of hung around and to my surprise, wrote some poems. I was actually slightly alarmed by that phenomenon. Wasn't what I expected.
Oh God,
so
this has been in there the whole time.
Put them in a drawer. I thought this is a sort of slightly strange kind of adolescent sort of, I don't know, impulse. Put them in a drawer and left them for a couple of years actually. But it kept sort of nagging at me a bit. And then eventually I came back to them. I still write, you know, a lot of the poetry that I write, quite a lot of it is still, or at least until very recently, a lot of it or most of it was translation or on some sort of spectrum between translation and imitation and response, you know, some kind of spectrum of relationship to existing poems. I guess I've written the proportion of poems that aren't in that category is like probably increasing, but
now you're sending stuff out, trying to get published, getting published. I'm really, really fascinated about how that's changed. Like, has that changed anything about the way that you're approaching the stuff that you're writing, particularly on your Substack? Because you wrote this great piece, which is why we're talking to you, which is what is a poetry magazine for? And it's like, I couldn't write that piece here in Australia because I just couldn't do it. Like, there are too many people who would get too angry and everything would go in like one day.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were very angry. I didn't anticipate quite how controversial that piece would be. I write my Substacks. I mean, I basically write them in the morning and publish them in the afternoon every Thursday. So I have a long list of kind of vague ideas and sort of notes towards things, but they're quite, you know, they're quite spontaneous. I'd vaguely been thinking about that one. It was more controversial than I expected, and I did get, as I alluded to in the following week's one, there were some pretty vile things that were said about me in some corners of the internet. Oh, but I don't know. It's just also silly, isn't it? It's just a poetry magazine at the end of the day. And it's a publicly funded poetry magazine as well. It receives significant public funding. So you should be able to say, you know, that you think it's good or it's not good without any problem. And I'm a loyal. I've paid for that. I've paid society membership for the Poetry Society for absolutely yonks. So I certainly should be able to. I think also, I mean, I suppose because I've always read poetry avidly since I was very small. I haven't always read contemporary poetry magazines. I've kind of come in and out with those. I did a bit sort of as a student, I suppose, and I have done off and on over the last kind of 25 years, but I've never been part of the poetry, you know, scene in the UK, really, not at all. And I'm not in the UK. I think that helps too. So yeah, I'm sure there were lots of people now who would never publish me, but there were probably people who were never going to publish me anyway. I mean, the poetry that I write is not particularly fashionable. So I guess I wasn't that bothered by that. And also, I don't know, I suppose it's partly being an academic. I mean, it's such a different culture, you know, the world, the kind of UK, the very small, kind of slightly precious UK poetry scene, where no one wants to offend anyone else because, you know, you will rely on each other to write nice reviews for each other, couldn't be more different, you know, from being an academic, especially in classics, you know, some quite traditional, crusty old academics, the kind of things they will write about your article or your book, or, you know, that kind of really totally gloves off, sometimes completely unnecessarily vicious peer review, is totally the opposite end of the spectrum. So I suppose from my perspective, you know, it seemed like quite moderate, but obviously not everyone agreed.
So you thought,
you know,
yeah.
I've got a, you know, a career. Okay, I'm leaving my career, so I suppose I don't really have a career, but I have a, you know, a scholarly reputation and a scholarly, I suppose, a profile, a profession as a scholar. I don't know, an identity. And I'm not 26, you know, I'm not 26. I'm in my mid-40s. I don't really mind if people don't agree with me. It's good. No, it's good. And I you know, some of the response I thought was really thoughtful and interesting. I mean, some of the disagreeing response was really thoughtful and interesting.
I have not heard the, you know, I followed with Alice. I read the comments in response on the page itself, which, as she said, are mostly quite polite and supportive and mostly in agreement. I would love to hear some more about the disagreement, but just in case anybody listening has not read the piece, here, let me just read the very beginning of the piece so that people can get a little bit of it in their ears. I was wondering this week why I almost never see reviews of literary magazines and poetry journals themselves. And then you go on to say that basically when you have occasionally seen poetry journals reviewed in public, it is for the sake of the writers rather than for the sake of the readers. That is, they're basically being reviewed as markets, not as publications. And then you go on to, you know, like not in you know, gruesome detail, but like in a fairly you know, systematic way, you talk through this particular issue of the Poetry Review, this UK publication, and your assessment overall is that it, I think you summarize it at the end. So on this showing, Poetry Review is a bit dour and clicky. There is some good writing both in prose and in the default form of serious, challenging free verse. But although there is some variety of style and form, there's much less variety of tone, and the overall effect is somewhat monochrome. You go on to talk a little bit about what sort of is implied about what is important in poetry, what seems to be the kind of the unstated philosophy of the magazine. But I'm curious, just given that this was, you showed your work, it didn't seem like you were you know, going off and making great claims without supporting it textually. It didn't seem to me at all mean-spirited. It wasn't a positive review, but it seemed like a pretty fair review. And as you said, one written by somebody who is very familiar with the magazine and has subscribed for quite a long time. What was the criticism you heard of this piece?
So there was quite a lot in the dustier corners of the internet. There was quite a lot of ad hominem, or rather ad feminem, I suppose we would say, criticism, which ranged from the kind of personal insult to implying that I was sort of in support of genocide in Gaza.
And this is not a total non sequitur, but you
not a total
mentioned
non
that
sequitur, because there was one element of this particular issue, the editorial, and a sort of sub element of the issue was concerned with Gaza, and I mentioned that in, I think, a fairly in not a way that would suggest that I supported genocide in Gaza. But I think some people found that because I hadn't made that the focus of the review, right, that was a problem. And I did, when I was writing the piece, I did wonder whether to say more about that, because actually it was one of the things that I thought initially when I first picked up the issue, I thought this is actually quite interesting, because the editorial, although it's rather fragmentary and didn't quite seem to know what to do, was perhaps thinking about, you know, was raising that obvious question, you know, how does one, in the face of real appalling kind of unthinkable violence or suffering, you know, is there a place for art? These are all, you know, these are cliches, these are cliches in themselves, but they're still interesting things to think about. And when you read the editorial, you get the impression maybe that the whole issue is actually about that, that the whole issue has been dedicated to that, which when I first began reading it, I thought, goodness, that's quite striking. That's quite a bold move, actually, from the Poetry Review. And I was quite interested to see how they would do that. But in fact, that's not what the issue is at all. It's sort of been split down the middle. So there are certain things that have been, I guess, commissioned or solicited, or even in some case maybe reprinted from earlier. I'm not sure. There were some kind of older pieces to fit that theme. And then there's a lot of material that I guess would just have been in there anyway, was kind of due for the next issue. So there was something a bit uneasy about that mixture, I thought, although I didn't really go into that, because if you have a kind of very kind of clear message, a clear moral or political message, then I think you aren't you probably asking or expecting your readers to suspend aesthetic judgment to some extent, kind of in exchange for kind of moral support or moral approval.
And you do say that the best poems are, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between the quality of the poems and the degree to which the poems are making a strong statement about death in Gaza. That those things seem to be just sort of independent of
yeah, it didn't seem to me that the best ones were those kind of relating to that particular theme in this issue. So I don't want to say that I don't think they should have done it. I thought it was actually quite brave in some ways for the editor to try and dedicate an issue to it. I thought, yeah, perhaps it wasn't wholly successful. And I thought it's also a little bit hard. Maybe this sounds very kind of petty, but it's a bit hard on the other people, isn't it? All those other people who were so excited to have got into poetry review finally. And then they're in this issue where, perhaps everyone feels that they have to sort of focus on the material relating to this theme, and anything that's not relating to that theme then sort of starts to look a bit trivial. I didn't think it quite worked. And just from a purely objective point of view, as a book, I suppose as an issue, I didn't think it quite worked. Now, of course, as I also say in the review, it's very artificial to sit down and read a whole journal or magazine from the front to the back. Yeah. Who does that? I never usually do that. I don't think anyone ever usually does that. I only ever read poetry collections even like that when I'm reviewing them. Otherwise, I don't. So it was a bit of an artificial exercise. And I said that, I think, fairly clearly at the start. But on the other hand, I thought it was important to do it that way, because otherwise it's quite unfair. Otherwise, you're just commenting on the things that kind of catch your eye. But I suppose it was, thinking of it and therefore assessing it as a kind of complete publication. Maybe that's an unfair thing to do. On the other hand, I can think of, editors of poetry magazines whom I know, who I've spoken to, who really do think, very carefully about their issue as a whole, as a kind of aesthetic whole, as a unit. Yeah. So I don't think it's reasonable to assess it in those terms.
No, I mean, maybe it's only the editors who expect that, but they do expect it. They do probably, hopefully, put their heart and soul into whatever their issue is. But the crazy thing about this is that, like you said, you're sitting down in the morning. It's beautifully written and it's very well backed up and researched, but it's just your thought for the day, and then suddenly it becomes like you're getting heat from people who have never met you and don't know you within some matter of hours. And it just, to me, it just kind of shows like we just never, like you just don't see anything written or said about poetry that isn't deadly polite. And like, because this is like, you're not going for the jugular. You make some really great points, but you're not, this is not like trying to stir up controversy here. It just,
yeah, no, absolutely. And it's very noticeable. The two pieces that have had the most traction are that one and the one I wrote at the beginning of the year about the T.S. Eliot prize winning collection this year, which was basically just a piece saying that I'd read it because it had won the prize and I didn't think it was very good. And that also got me into trouble. That also got a lot of attention. So that there clearly is a real kind of, I suppose, criticism, even fairly moderate criticism, is maybe always more interesting, I don't know, or more exciting to more people. But I think you're right that there is a real sense of kind of taboo almost about it for some reason in the poetry world, which, as I say, really wouldn't hold in the kind of academic world that I also have a foot in.
Yeah. So you're able to kind of operate from this like semi-protected or fully protected vantage point where you're like, I can say these things because I don't actually care what you guys think. Like, you're not going to destroy my life. Whereas, as I say, if I tried to write something like this, I'd be screwed.
it's not that I don't care. Of course, I'm interested to what people think, but you know, if no UK poetry magazine ever wants to publish a poem of mine, that's a bit sad. But you know, it's not a disaster at all. That's not my life.
Yeah, I don't know how it is in the UK. I mean, at least in the US, like there are plenty of places that would nominally blackball you, but the problem is that like the memories are short and mastheads turn over. So in the UK, it may be a little bit stodgier, but it seems over here it's very hard to get blackballed for very long from somewhere because it's like everybody's gone 5 years from now.
Yeah, and also I think it's quite, you know, the people that make noise online about this kind of thing, it's always quite a small group, you know. It feels like everyone, it feels unpleasant when it's happening to you, but I think it's only ever actually quite a small number of people. And you know, I received an awfully large number of messages saying that they, you know, agreed with me to various different extents. And would like to see more straightforward criticism like that, or at least straightforward response.
So something I mean, reading through and then rereading it was those two pieces you mentioned, and then the piece on poetry for children, which I also really enjoyed, that I read and then reread, and going back through them, I was briefly sort of panicked because I thought, well, the problem is that I basically agree with just about everything she's saying, and so then like I feel like, well, you know, the only role I can try to play is devil's advocate. But there is like a small distinction I feel like is worth making here, which is that it is not the case that you are, you know, saying the forbidden thing or you know, just saying out loud what everybody knows but is afraid to voice. It seems to me that part of what you do in these pieces that I really appreciate and I sort of aim for sometimes myself when I write occasionally, you know, prose about poetry or on this podcast, is not to speak in an antagonistic way or a snarky way, but to speak without knowingness. Because it seems like so much of how we talk about poetry involves a set of unspoken rules that we've agreed that there's a way we're supposed to talk about it. We've agreed that there's a certain kind of game we're playing. We've agreed that there's certain ways we do and don't refer to things. And you come in with a kind of like you're you know, as I said, like you're very knowledgeable, very thoughtful, but you come in with an almost like Socratic naivete, where you say like, okay, well, like, what if I were to come to this as somebody who merely has read lots of books and cares a lot about poetry? What might I think? Sort of letting go of all of the implied givens as you come in. And I'm curious. I mean, listening to you, it seems like that may just be part of your personality, but it is. I think it's part of what I find really like. There are sort of merely deliciously bitchy versions of like, you know, criticism about poetry that I've read at times, and those can be really fun, but you are doing something different than that, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. And as I said in the piece that I wrote after the poetry review piece, you know, clearly there's a seam that could be mined there. You know, I could get a lot of followers by writing similar things all the time, but it's not at all what I want to do. I write the Substack because I love poetry. I love thinking about poetry, and especially poetry and translation, the links between those things. And
we should say again, we'll mention it later, but it's called Horace and Friends. That is the name of it, and it's telling, I think, because you were like, first is your love of poetry, like that is behind everything, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. Poetry and grammar. That's the other thing. I really love thinking about grammar in different languages. So, you know, what it aspires to do is to, you know, share knowledge and enthusiasm, and, you know, elicit enthusiasm reciprocally. So I do think that, you know, being critical, even being negative to some extent, is an important part of that, because taste is cultivated by practice. You know, that's how one develops good taste, is by practicing it, by reading and thinking and discerning and thinking about the difference between something that works and something that doesn't, and why it does or doesn't. But it's really not what I want. You know, criticism is not what I want. The focus of the criticism in a negative sense is not my focus at all. Criticism in the positive sense, you know, of discovering good things, and also how we learn to, you know, how we come to recognize what is good. Obviously, that's a life's work, and especially when you're thinking about multiple traditions and the ways in which different traditions or languages might interact.
Yeah. So listeners should know that like we're pulling you towards these two pieces that you wrote, which do have like even just a slightly, because that's just the people that we are, but that's not who you are. And so
We're assholes, but you seem to
we're
be,
assholes.
yeah.
But Victoria's really nice,
Right,
actually.
yeah.
No, and look, I enjoyed writing those pieces, and I don't mind winding people up a little bit, especially if it produces good, good conversation. Like you do, when you're teaching, obviously sometimes you say something a bit, it's a bit provocative, you're winding them up a little bit, to get a response, because once you get a response, then you can start crystallizing, can't you? Then you can start pinning down what people actually think, or what you think, or what you feel. So it's often helpful, but yeah, I do see it as a positive, ideally as a positive project, ultimately. I mean, I'm not embarrassed. Obviously, most poetry that's published at any time is rubbish. I spend most of my professional time sitting around looking at manuscripts, kind of archives from the 16th century, from the 17th century, thousands upon thousands of pretty terrible poems. I mean, terrible in a different way from most of what's in Poetry Review, but still, the kind of the default kind of formulaic poem at any point, or piece of art at any point, is not very good. The great bits are rare, and they rise from that, and they're obviously hard to spot, hard to find at the time. None of this is news.
Well, I wish more people actually thought that, though. Like, not thought it, but could accept it. Because I keep having this conversation with people. They'll come to me and they'll be like, Alice, I think I'm falling out of love with poetry. Like, everything I read is making me so sad. I hate it. I hate everything. I think I have to give it up. And I just want to shake them and be like, it's all shit. Most of it is shit. It's okay. Like, it doesn't mean you need to give it up. Like, I really loved the On Being Underwhelmed piece. I felt ever so slightly attacked by parts of it when you were talking about.
This is the piece on the recent winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is the biggest of big deal prizes in the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It is the big one, and the collection that won it had already won. I think it was the Forward Prize as well. It had already won something else too.
Yeah.
So.
And this is Jason Allen Passant's self-portrait as Othello. So
that's right.
You kind of came to that with a sort of like a willful naivete, and like, oh, okay, so this has won the big prize. How is it? And the response was, again, like very thoughtful and measured, and I think fair, but like, oh, well, so not that great ultimately was sort of the answer. But yeah, sorry, Al, I was just trying to give it some context. Alice, go ahead.
No, thank you. Yeah. The writing feels uneven or undigested. And I think you said, as a reader of a prize-winning collection, I expect variety and a display of skill, which it sounds very much like you don't get when you read this. But the piece is called On Being Underwhelmed. And I guess I wanted to ask, is that really the actual emotion that you felt? Because like I said, when I'm having these conversations with people, people are like enraged, disappointed, ready to give up on poetry as a whole. Like this kind of thing, the books that win prizes, it's funny. Like I feel like they devastate people in this way that doesn't really get articulated outside of a one-to-one conversation. But anyway, I guess my question is like, are you being polite when you say I was underwhelmed?
No, I don't think that's a really good question, a really thoughtful question. No, I don't think so. Partly, I suppose, because I wasn't that surprised that I didn't like it that much.
That was the only moment where I slightly questioned your honesty, was when you said it's striking to have this response to a question that, I thought like, is it that striking, or is this sort of expected?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I hadn't really, perhaps that was a bit, I mean, well, I wouldn't say it's dishonest. I hadn't really sat down and
it was polite. It was
polite. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about what I expected. Part of what I did find a bit genuinely surprising in that particular case is that it seemed quite poorly edited. It's not just that I thought the poetry was a bit lackluster, but actually that, if I had an editor's hat on, there seemed like some quite obvious things to do to tighten it up. And I was quite surprised that hadn't been, that hadn't somehow been done, or perhaps it had been done and been rejected, or, who knows what the story is. But I thought, because there are different elements, aren't there, in creating a really good book of poems. I don't want to overstate this at all. I thought there were some really nice moments in the book, and there are some quite musical moments as well, which then sort of fade out. They never kind of get he never sort of sits with it somehow. It seems to me, he sort of moves towards creating some kind of musical pattern and then always backs away from it, which could it be itself, that could be the sort of leitmotif itself, couldn't it? But it doesn't quite do that either. It felt undeveloped in that sense, both from the authorial perspective, but also I thought from the editorial perspective, and that surprised me a bit, because it's a great press, it's a really fantastic press, and lots of the things that they publish are really, they publish lots of my favorite poets. So I thought that was worth, flagging as well. And I wonder whether, the kind of autobiographical, the sort of memoir in verse kind of feel of the collection, maybe that pushes towards editing less. I don't know. So I don't think it was disingenuous, the underwhelmness. I don't feel any despair about poetry at all. I only feel pleasure, really. Of course, I sometimes feel frustrated about, judgments that I don't agree with, but I suppose I'm a classicist ultimately. Poetry is so vast. They're never going to take Pindar away from us, or Homer away from us, or Kalidasa away from us, or the Rig Veda, or the Book of Common Prayer, or all the best things, all the best bits of poetry. They're all still there. It doesn't matter what rubbish is being adulated today. And every poet has said the same. Horace says the same. Pope says the same. Oh my goodness, it's terrible. All the rubbish poets that everyone's going on about today.
I read the distinction between being underwhelmed and being in despair as the difference between being a reader and being a writer. Like I think I wonder if a lot of the people who are expressing that total despair to you, Alice, are not coming at it mostly, coming at these books mostly as poets. Whereas if you're coming at it in sort of with readerly hopes, then you might merely be disappointed rather than be.
Yeah, no, these people want to have won that prize.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah.
So I just, because again, I don't want to. You say it's at one point of an interview in the Poetry Review. In this issue, the conversation described as an intertwined discussion is between Tashani Doshi and Safia Kamaria Kinshasa. I always enjoy reading this kind of thing, though I do think there is some loss of edge compared to the best interviews. The mutual format means there's a lot of polite flattery and congratulation, which, let's be honest, can be boring to read. Couldn't agree more. But then I also thought, all right, well, don't let this become that. So it did make me wonder, because there are a few notes both in this piece and in the in the piece on being underwhelmed and in the piece on the Poetry Review, where you sort of say okay, it seems like this is what they're after, or it seems like you say in the review of the Poetry Review, the style and terms of these essays, there's some essay reviews at the back, give a good overview of the preoccupations of the magazine. The framework in which the poetry is discussed is insistently morally, socially, and politically serious, even moralizing, with a particular focus on the expression of personal identity and experience. A diligent new reader of Poetry Review might conclude that these are the proper subjects for poetry and the proper terms for its assessment. And you say something, I think it's not exactly the same, but kind of related, about the Alain Passant book, that his identity and his kind of personal account of, the book of poetry as memoir or as, even diary seems to be the implied goal here, that what you might come to poetry for, they may not even be after the same thing. And so it made me wonder about, I saw a note in one of your reader responses that is a frequent note struck over here among certain circles, which is, oh, this is all the Emperor's New Clothes, thank you for calling it out. And I thought, there's sort of three different possibilities. One is that it's the Emperor's New Clothes, meaning nobody likes it, nobody gets it, this is just bullshit, and we're all kind of trying not to look ignorant to one another. Another possibility is that there's no accounting for taste. Some people are into this, and even if you're not, it doesn't mean that they can't take pleasure in it. And then another possibility is just that they're after something else. They're on the same ball field, but they're playing a different game. And you do seem, I think that's part of what I like about your sort of your lack of knowingness, that you say okay, well, maybe this is what one might think, this is what they're after. I'm curious, what is your slightly more knowing thought on that? Because you say of the something Alice even mentioned in her podcast, that you say one gets the impression that one is being talked across or shut out. That like I'm not, even though I'm a longtime subscriber to this, I'm not the target audience for this. So I guess my question is like, well, how do you imagine the target audience, or how do you imagine like assuming for a moment that all of it's in good faith, that all of it is sincere, that all of it is serious, that people are actually pursuing real ends, and maybe they're just different ends than what you go to poetry for or I go to poetry for. What do you think of that?
Yeah. So
sorry, I asked you like a 10-minute question, which is my
no,
job.
I'm just I'm
but
digesting.
answer the question I should have asked, I should say.
I do think most people who are involved are certainly writing and reading in good faith, which I suppose was one core of your question. I do think that sometimes, one is just talking at cross purposes. And there was one particular response to the first of those pieces, the one about the T.S. Eliot winner. There was one particular response which I thought showcased that quite well. It was a comment that I thought showed someone who was prepared to, sort of unpack their thinking that just came from a very, very different angle. I think it is clearly true that for quite a lot of people reading and writing poetry today, that it's not really a matter of sound. It's not really about speech, or at least that they think that if that is their interest, then they sort of go off into more explicitly kind of spoken word or performative verse, and that's a kind of separate zone. So I think for quite a lot of genuine enthusiasts for poetry today, it is a much more on the page phenomenon than I guess it is for me. And I think that explains some of the differences in perspective. And that can be as it were, a sort of a positive and informed position. And some of that poetry I enjoy. I think what's noticeable, especially when you're teaching, is that a lot of students, even students who are enthusiastic about literature or enthusiastic about poetry, can't hear meter, can't hear traditional meter. They don't have it in their heads, or even though actually if they do have it in their heads, they don't know that they do. It hasn't been sort of shown to them what the connection between the nursery rhymes they know, or the songs that they know, or the picture books in rhyme that they know, what that might have to do with sort of poetry as a tradition. So sometimes I think there's a kind of steering away from engaging with using those kind of elements creatively, but also engaging with them critically because people feel unconfident. And I don't think that's helped by the kind of counter force, which is a certain kind of critic and a certain kind of poet who's kind of, constantly saying, oh, the feet aren't right in this, or there's a foot missing, or I don't know, this kind of sort of spoddy, I don't know, that's probably not a very American word, kind of, the kind of tech guy kind of approach to poetry.
Yeah, the poetry well, actually, man.
Sorry, I missed that.
Is Mr. Well, actually.
I don't think that's helpful either. I suppose what I'm saying is I think there can be a people who are genuinely looking for something else, or at least not perhaps entirely something else, because I think there's an overlap in the kind of good writing that those people would appreciate and that I would appreciate, but that are less interested anyway in a zone that I am interested in. And then there are also perhaps quite a lot of people who just aren't quite sure how to operate in that zone. It's noticeable to me, I did a project, some workshops with poets as an academic. It was an academic project, but some workshops with poets last year. And it was quite striking to me that a couple of poets who actually use metrical effects very successfully in their own work were obviously made very anxious and uncomfortable about being asked to comment on it. So these are obviously people with good, with great ears, great natural ears, but who didn't have the apparatus to discuss it and felt sort of put on the spot about being asked to, which I thought was really interesting.
Oh, wait, sorry, just to clarify, because I thought you meant something slightly different. You're saying these were poets who were writing good metrical verse, but they were uncomfortable when called upon to comment on it. They seemed to be uncomfortable because they seemed not to have the knowledge to comment on it, or because they it is, I can imagine being uncomfortable, being called upon to talk about that for a variety of reasons, some of which might not have to do with technical equipment. But this was, but it's also like the formal free verse split over there is less of a is less embattled than it is here, I guess.
Yeah, it's a very different landscape, as I've commented on a couple of times on the Substack. And there is a kind of, although it's not very visible in terms of who wins the prizes and stuff, there is a very kind of durable British tradition of poetry writing, which is very much in the middle, very much in the middle. So, you know, a good, and I think this is a sensible, I mean, maybe it reveals my Britishness, but I think it's basically the right position. A good poet ought to be able to do, you know, a good poet writing in the early 21st century ought to be able to do good free verse. They ought to be able to write, you know, a decent sonnet, and they ought to be able to write, you know, decent poetry in the middle, which is actually what, historically speaking, taking a slightly longue durée approach, most British poets have done. So, you know, they write a lot of poems which have some, you know, metrical effect, some rhyme or whatever, some recognizable uses of meter, but aren't a sonnet, aren't a ballad, aren't a, you know, a set kind of traditional form, as it were. So the poets in which I observed this phenomenon were poets writing that kind of poetry. So clearly, you know, musical, metrically sensitive poetry, not, you know, setting out to write a sonnet or a villanelle or anything. But when asked, you know, goodness, if I said, you know, I found the metrical effects in this poem really striking, you know, how conscious were you of what you were doing, for instance, in that poem, were quite uncomfortable. So clearly this is, you know, naturally musically talented, metrically talented people with a really good ear, who don't have the words to describe what they're doing. I don't think that's a problem at all. You know,
you're making me have a new thought than I've ever had before about Plato's Ion, right? Which is the little short dialogue where he's interviewing a reciter of poems, and there's a kind of interesting conflation in that dialogue between reciting poems and writing poems, and it's kind of treated as it's all received from the muse. So you're the vehicle for the poetry, so it almost doesn't matter whether you wrote it or you're just reciting it. But Ion generally comes off as sort of a beautiful moron, you know, in a way. Like he clearly doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. He's just good at reciting, but he seems to be kind of an empty vessel. And I think that probably is fairly true. And he's not, by my lights, a poet so much as a performer. But you're just what you said just now makes me wonder if there's not in a slightly more historical version of that conversation, if it might not be coyness. Because I'm imagining if I were asked in front of an audience, right, outside of a one-on-one conversation, to comment on meter, and I care a lot about meter. I've studied meter. I know a reasonable amount, not as much as Chris Childers, but like a reasonable amount about meter. If I were asked to comment on it in front of an audience, I would definitely plead ignorance, because my thought as a poet is that there's nothing to be gained by my commenting learnedly about my own meter and metrical effects. That I can only diminish the effect of the poem, and I'm much better off pretending to be dumb and letting the poem be what it is. But I don't know. I mean, you also, like, I don't know the context of this work. I'm actually really interested in what particularly this workshop was. And you're, you know, of course, like a teacher and a scholar. So you have maybe a slightly more a sharper eye for exactly what that conversation was about. But I'm curious if any of that rings true, or with that.
Yeah, I think in this, it was actually quite an intimate setting. So it was just an online workshop with 2 or 3 poets and me. So it wasn't a very public setting. So I think in the particular case I'm thinking of, I totally understand. I see what you're saying, absolutely. And I can imagine a poet not wanting to get down into the weeds of that kind of technical description, as you say, for the reasons that you give. I don't think that was the case here, which is why it struck me, but I might be wrong, obviously. They were workshops. It was part of a project that I was, a very recondite project, actually, about Protestant Latin poetry from the 16th century. And as a kind of corollary to the scholarly project on Protestant Latin verse, I ran some workshops with contemporary poets writing, broadly speaking, religious verse in English, for whom English was either not their first language or one of more than one first languages. Because the point was to think about to interrogate a little bit why it is that lots of the first couple of generations of Protestants chose to write Latin verse, and to think about the possible kind of contemporary parallel with English as the international language today, just as Latin was the international language in that context. So it was quite a specific category of poets that I was talking to. They were really absolutely fascinating discussions, I have to say, with poets from a whole range of religious traditions, although often saying, in fact, quite similar things. And maybe, I suppose, to come back to the original point, perhaps because they were poets writing, broadly speaking, religious poetry, many of them drew a connection between liturgy, broadly understood, and poetry, or an early love of poetry, or an early sense of the power of poetry. And obviously liturgy is a phenomenon that relies upon repetition and familiarity, memorableness, has lots of points in common with traditional poetry as a spoken form, as an oral form. So that might have skewed my poets, I suppose, to some extent towards poets with an interest in those areas.
But I derailed the train slightly, but the implication of your observation is, if I understand it, that there's a reasonable portion of contemporary poets writing in meter whose knowledge is effectively like by ear, self-taught, like what Derek Walcott claimed about his own, that he claimed he had no real, he didn't know how to scan, but he could hear it. And that seems to be what's happening, what you're observing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, all real poets are doing it by ear, aren't they? Whether they know the terms or not. Some of them know the terms and some of them don't. But knowing the terms is not going to help you if you can't hear it.
Wait,
that's like a lot of new formalist poetry. A lot of new formalist poetry today, I would say, is people who know the rules and don't have an ear for it.
Don't have an ear, yeah. And I was very struck as a graduate student, I won't name any names, but being taught by a very, very distinguished scholar. When this person read poetry aloud, I mean, they couldn't hear it. I thought I just thought that was extraordinary. I thought this is someone who spent an entire career writing about 17th century poetry and actually can't hear it. I found that very admirable in a way, because obviously they were motivated by other, I don't know, other.
It's like a colorblind art historian. Like what?
I suppose, or perhaps the interest was primarily kind of historical, or I don't know. But plenty of people working on literature can't really hear poetry. But
and I guess conversely, plenty of people writing it can hear it, but can't comment on it. Can't.
Yeah, exactly. Might not know the terms. And I think English. I mean, this gets into the weeds a bit, but English meter has been particularly poorly described. So a lot of the sort of technical descriptions are just are quite inadequate. As soon as
would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, as soon as you start talking about feet in English, I think you're talking nonsense. 95% of the time, most English verse doesn't have feet, and you still see that. You still see so many people obsessing about feet. I find it completely baffling.
Victoria, you are blowing my mind. Can I please come and study with you in Paris, because I really need this approach to things. You just seem so relaxed about it all. Just to go back to like the baseball analogy, though, it sort of sounds like what you're describing is like we are all on the same field, but some of us are like skipping over here. Somebody's like playing hopscotch. There's a little soccer game going on, and then somebody's like basket weaving over there. And occasionally the basket weavers will be like, "Hey, why are you skipping?" And it just doesn't. That's why the conversation doesn't make sense. Like we're all just playing completely different games.
Yeah, well, yes.
And why get uptight about that?
Perhaps overlapping games sometimes.
Overlapping games, yeah.
Overlapping games. I mean, it's a big.
But it is something I do like when I was thinking about what makes your prose enjoyable. The sort of the three coinciding virtues that came to mind were that it is very well informed, but it has a very light touch. And then third, that the compass seems always to be pleasure. That like you are clearly a very knowledgeable, you're much more knowledgeable than either of us, but you are still sort of always guided by what brings pleasure, whether it's, a simple or a sophisticated pleasure. And
Yeah,
that's the thing I am, that is where I get most cynical and skeptical of contemporary poetry, is when it seems like there is a lack of people being guided by pleasure on some level, somebody's pleasure.
yes. Yeah, no, I think that is reasonable. Yeah, I do think poetry should be beautiful. That's its proper virtue, isn't it? Yes, I think that's fair, guided by pleasure. As you say, there are lots of different types of pleasures, aren't there? I wrote about Julia Donaldson being a really good poet. I don't know whether you have her books in the States, but one of the most prolific writers.
You said Julia Donaldson?
Julia Donaldson, yeah, she's one of the most prolific writers of children's picture books in the UK. But she's a really good poet. And I always think of her every time, you get this kind of breastfeeding about how no one can make any money writing poetry. But I assume Julia Donaldson really has I hope she has made some serious money, because she's a really good metrical poet. And she makes something which is actually super hard look really, really easy. And that's one kind of pleasure. Yeah. I mean, a really beautifully turned children's rhyming picture book. That's a real pleasure. And especially, when you have to read those things 45 times in the space of 48 hours or whatever. The ones that are good, it's the greatest critical test of all. If it's still good, 45th time, it's the real deal. And yeah, at the other end, I guess I do find, I mentioned grammar at the beginning. I do find grammar just incredibly, aesthetically pleasurable. So I try to keep that a bit out of the Substack, because I know the audience is small for the locative absolutes or whatever, but I do get really excited about grammar and syntax in other languages. And the way that the structure of a language, the grammar and syntax of a language interacts with what you do or can do in poetry, what you can't do, the shape of the linguistic shape of a poetry. And I do think that, if there is a kind of key difference between good poetry, real poetry, and prose, it is something to do with it being about the language that it's written in. Prose isn't really about the language that it's written in, it's using the language that it's written in. Whereas it seems to me that real poetry always is about that language, feeling for the edges of it, feeling for its particular kind of shape and genius and pleasure. So yeah, the connection between poetry and grammar is quite serious for me, actually, quite integral, I think.
I mean, I don't, and I have not gone through all of the archives of your Substack, but if there were a sort of a broad thesis statement essay to write on why grammar is so integral to poetry, that's one I would love to read. I don't know if that's on your long list of potential topics, but I think that came to me a few times reading your comments on poetry was maybe like a little bit of a split that I have perceived sometimes between a critical lens on poetry and a writerly one. That you say, I mean, even just now you said that a good poet ought to be able to write in strict meter, in free verse, and in the happy the golden middle ground. What's the Ryan's always said, via mediocritas, which I and or you say as Alice cited in the piece on the Alain Passant book, that when you read, as a reader of a prize winning work, you expect was it variety and
display of skill.
Yeah, variety and display of skill, and you give a few possibilities for different ways in which variety might be achieved. But what I wondered about was that those to me seem very much to be totally reasonable very readerly or critical views of poetry. And I wonder, in your own experience, and even just, saying like, oh, well, you had a little time to yourself, you went to a museum, you found yourself writing some things, hiding them shamefacedly in a drawer, feeling kind of bashful about them. And I think, like, when I am reading as a critic, I can step back and say like, well, here's what a book ought to do, or here's what, I noticed that you started this music in the first poem, but it didn't really get developed anywhere, as you said, the Olympusant piece. And I thought, well, like, as a critic, that makes a lot of sense. As a critic, it makes a lot of sense. Like, well, if you're going to be a poet, you should be able to do this. You should be able to do that. You should have this tool in your tool belt. And it's hard to argue with that, at face value. But as a writer, my experience is always that no matter how much I try to gain skills and learn things and add to the tools that I have at my disposal, it is a dark and thorny and personal and weird and slightly difficult to account for process. And it is very hard for me to say what is going to come out of it that's going to have any value. And so for me, like, particularly when it comes to putting together a book, the question is really like, well, over the course of all of these weird, mostly failed experiments, what is the handful of stuff that seems still worth somebody else's time? And definitely not in my mind is like, oh, did I develop this theme throughout it? Or does this supply a reasonable range of, like, it's more like, what is not garbage? And God only knows how that came out of, my efforts. Well, no matter how much I might try to expand my horizons. I just wonder if you've had any thoughts about that, especially coming to poetry as a little bit later as a writer of it.
Yeah, I think you're right that I guess my perspective is primarily a readerly one. I suppose yeah, it's a funny sort of thing, isn't it? A poetry collection. And there does seem to be, there's quite an obsession. I see it discussed a lot with kind of the ordering of poems and the theme of a collection and all that kind of thing. And I don't really care. I don't read poetry like that. The only time I read poetry collections like that is when I have to review them and feel I should dutifully say something about the sequence or the theme, because I know it's important to poets and editors and so on. But that's not how I read poetry. And I'd be surprised if it's how most actually enthusiastic readers of poetry read poetry. You flick through and then something catches your eye and you read something else. And, what does it matter if you've read a poem once? I mean, that's failure, isn't it? The only poems that have worked are the poems that you've read more than once. You've gone back and read again, or written out, or sent to someone, or even memorized maybe. That's when the poem lives. That's when it succeeds. And it doesn't do that in a collection. It doesn't do that with any regard to what the theme is usually, or where it sits, or what it sits next to. So obviously there are exceptions to that. There are some, if you study some certain classic collections, then you do think about the ordering. And there are some, there have been clearly some collections or sort of sub collections which do have an astonishing kind of collective power. But it's very rare, isn't it? It's very rare. So it seems to me there's a kind of odd disjunction. I mean, someone was talking about Tom Gunn's Man with Night Sweats. I saw it's just been released, or it's going to be re-released, which seems to me like an example of that. That is an astonishing individual poems and an amazing collection that does work as a collection, partly because of the ways in which it's thinking about, formal 17th century elegy collections. So it's thinking about the form of a collection historically as well in an extremely sophisticated, fascinating way.
And it has like a very specific and very intense historical occasion for it, like, to exist.
Exactly, it has an occasion, and he was the master of writing about occasion and poetry. Gunn, so these two things kind of really came together for him there. And what it does so kind of heartbreakingly beautifully is it takes that formal, that historic form, which is a collection of commissioned elegies for a single person, and he makes it this, series for unnamed multitudes. I mean, we have individual people that he knew, obviously, but it stands for the multitudes of AIDS deaths. So just what he does formally, not at the individual poem level, but at the collection level, is also, really remarkable in that particular instance. And you might say something similar about, Milton's 1645 poems, for instance. That really is a a collection that had an enormous impact as a collection, but these instances are really rare. So it always seems to me there's a bit of a disjunct, and I guess this gets to your point about thinking like a reader or thinking like a writer. Clearly, poets are told, I guess, by editors, I don't know, by everyone, that, you know, it really matters how a collection is structured and where things go, and maybe it's to do with sales, or I don't know, but there seems to be quite a disjunction between that and how one actually, you know, reads poetry, what one sort of looks for, and what it means to have written a good poem. Which, yeah, I mean, you asked me what I think about if one has aspirations as a writer of poems. It's just to write one good poem, isn't it? That's all that matters. One good poem. Always very moved by Ben Jonson, you know, saying that he would have thrown away everything he'd written to have written The Burning Babe by Robert Southall, you know, this one poem. You know, Jonson wrote a handful of perfect poems himself, and a very much larger number of very nearly perfect poems. So he was probably maybe exaggerating for rhetorical effect, but you get, you know, he's right. All that matters is one good poem. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess I think such a...
Sorry, yeah. It just struck me then just that there is just such a massive gulf between the way editors think, the way poets end up thinking, and then the person at the end who's like, oh God, I got to read this, which is usually my reaction to stuff that gets sent to me. But yeah, like, I don't know, if anything matters in the ordering, first poem, last poem, maybe that's it.
Mm-hmm.
They both have to be good. Like, those should be, what I was taught in grad school was that those should be your two best poems.
First and the last.
Because, I mean, at least for me, like, that's what I typically do. If I pick up a book off the bookshelf at the store, is I'll flip to the beginning and the end. And if it doesn't at least give me some reason to think that there's more to find inside, then it's, you know, if I will, which is unfortunately it's part of my prejudice against long poems, because if I flip to the end and it's like it's a 20-pager, I think like, well,
yeah, don't end on your 20 page, please don't. Just don't write it. But yeah, I don't know, it's just it's I'm just having this like brain explosion right now where it's just like every single part of that equation, poet, editor, publisher, not reader. I think readers are innocent in this equation, but like the poet, the editor, and the publisher, if the editor's even there, which in Australia they're often not, they're just living in like their own little delusive bubble, and nothing that they believe is like has any bearing on the reality of the other people. So like, yeah, just jumping back to the piece, what is a poetry magazine for, just for a second, like those editors have all these delusions about what's important, what they need to do, and how people are going to receive what they do. And then mostly, this is a print journal, isn't it? Mostly people are going to receive it and unwrap it, and it's going to sit somewhere for 6 to 18 months, and then it's going to get moved somewhere else.
Recycling bin, yeah.
Now that's a very cynical line to take with you, Victoria, and I apologize, but
I suppose, I mean, the sort of move online is, I mean, maybe changes the dynamic a bit as well, doesn't it? Because people do share single poems, images of single poems very easily now, which is quite nice. I quite like it. It sort of reminds me of manuscript culture. You know, poems circulate kind of with a life of their own, and also quite a lot of the new poetry, kind of online poetry magazines that have sprung up. Often the format is pretty simple. You know, it's just a poem on per page, so it's very easy to share the link to just to a single poem. And I don't know, the format of different journals that I've seen online varies in how sort of sophisticated they are, but quite often, you know, the navigation's a bit clunky, so it doesn't, I mean, again, the order's not, you know, not going to make much difference. But I quite like the sort of, I don't know, I know there's a lot of worry that, you know, everything being online, our attention spans are too short, no one gets to the end of a poem anymore. But at least for kind of shorter lyric, I think there's something quite exciting about the online space.
For short lyrics, I mean, at least as a total non-scholar, my sense has been that that's almost always how individual lyrics survive, is by being passed on one by one. You know, that somebody says, hey, you've got to read this. And it gets, I mean, often, you know, historically, it would just be memorized and passed on that way. But that kind of one-to-one endorsement is really like, that's the lifeblood of poems over time. So it seems like, I'm not a big Twitter person, but it seems like that's maybe one of the better things that it does, is give you that opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Being able to share a good poem, and a lot of the books by new poets that I buy for that reason. Someone shares a poem, you think, goodness, that's good, and so you order the book, and you're quite right, of course, about historically how poems have circulated, especially shorter poems, and often poets stress a lot about titles too, which again, from a kind of historical perspective,
right,
seems baffling, because they're the first thing to get lost, and there's no point titling a poem in a manuscript culture, because whoever writes it down will give it their own title anyway, often something totally different. And also even authorship disappears very quickly. Things get attributed to, when people are making their own, early modern individuals making their own collections, as everyone did, people have a tendency to attribute any poem they like to their favorite poet. So you get these kind of groupings. And even with very major, like for instance, between Ben Jonson and John Donne, we still have a couple of poems we don't know whether Ben Jonson or John Donne wrote them, which seems extraordinary if you think about
which is remarkable. Yeah, like the school of Ben and yeah,
exactly. They seem like such that they seem, the kind of the way that we think of those poets is in reference to poems in styles which are very different from each other. But there is actually a kind of a big zone in the middle where they were writing quite similar things. So I suppose I quite like the online space from a poetry perspective.
And that is, what much more than your, offering criticisms of contemporary poetry, what you, and even in the piece on the TSLA prize winning book, that what you seem to do most with your Substack is say, hey, here's some things you should read, as well as, hey, tell me some things I should read. So that's part of what I find very, very charming. And it seems very genuine that it does, and you've got it, as Al said, like you've got a good little community of people who are very eager and earnest about sharing recommendations or taking your recommendations to heart.
Yeah, I love getting recommendations. In fact, I've subscribed to 2 magazines as a result of that post, where people commented both online, both on the Substack itself, but also a lot of private correspondence recommending their favorite magazines or journals.
Is there a good one or two to mention here for people who might?
Well, I haven't got that far with them yet, because obviously it hasn't been that long. But one magazine that I'd actually never really read and should have done is Shearsman in the UK.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of translated, a lot of translation in a really interesting way. And then someone also recommended a Scottish journal called The Interpreter, I think it's called.
Okay.
Which again,
is that also translation, or is that?
Does a lot of translations, yeah, always in parallel text, and which does actually deliver. Since Brexit, there's been a problem. A lot of UK poetry journals cannot post reliably to France.
Oh.
So I let quite a few of my subscriptions lapse, but The Interpreter, because of its international reach, I guess, does deliver to France, so that's good. But I think you're right. The sort of driving spirit of it, hopefully, is sort of enthusiasm, sharing good poems, and thinking about the ways in which poetry in French or Latin or Greek or Sanskrit might relate to enthusiastic reading in English.
Yeah, so I don't want to keep you forever, but there were just two, maybe one and a half other quick thoughts I wanted to touch on. I did, as I said, I really enjoyed your piece on poetry for children. And I also have small children. I spend a lot of time reading and rereading books to them. I do find that, as you said, like it is a remarkable test of the quality of writing, that, whether you can read something over and over and over again and have it not be just utter torture. Though I find that while my daughters certainly I do read a lot of things over and over again, and they often want the same thing read over and over again, what I can stand to hear over and over tends almost never to be what they want to hear over and over. Like the handful of children's books that I think like, oh, this has a little elegance to it. It sort of has a bittersweet note. It's kind of, it rings true. It seems like it's touching on something authentic. Those they quickly tire of. And it's the dumbest and least, like the least durable by my lights that they end up, I have read the day the crayons went on strike or whatever it was. Like I've read that one about, like, for the last 50 nights in a row. But Goodnight Moon had a very short shelf life from their perspective. But you have it was a wonderful piece about children's verse and and children's books. But you made an observation that just really struck a nerve about what makes for really good children's literature, both from a storytelling perspective and from the perspective of language and poetry. You talk about two sort of authors or pieces in particular. One is I'd never heard of either. One is Fenelon, who was writing in the 17th century and wrote a kind of a medley pastiche of great myths and stories for children, but it has a real charm and momentum to it, and it kind of introduces you to all of these old stories, so that then later, if you were to read, say, the Iliad or the Old Testament, you would recognize a lot of what you'd been told, but you'd originally heard it in this kind of magical, mix of a landscape. And then the other is this contemporary poet, Gross. I don't think I have his first name here.
Philip Gross.
Philip Gross, yeah, but he writes both for children and for adults. And you found, you read both of those, both his adult and his children's poems as a child, and found a lot of value in them. But the thing that I was really glad you pointed out, because it chimes with my own experience, is that some of the most magical and memorable books I read as a kid were not really properly children's books, or they were sort of like weird children's books. And part of what I loved about them was knowing that I wasn't getting everything, like knowing that it was sort of alluding to this other world that I didn't really have access to, but that it left a kind of a longing. It left a sense of wanting to know, like, oh, there is more to discover. There is this whole adult world in which all of this would make a little bit more sense. There's a whole other context to acquire that I don't yet have, whether that's linguistic or mythological. But yeah, I thought it was a wonderful observation, and you walk through it in some really very particular examples. But I thought of, like, as a kid, I read a lot of my grandmother's old book, like Edgar Rice Burroughs or Charles Kingsley or Nathaniel Hawthorne's Wonder Book, and it was often kind of like, it was accessible enough for me to get something, not to be totally lost or bored or scandalized, but it was also often a little dangerous, a little weird, a little unnerving, or I would have a sense that, like, I'm not totally, there is a thing here that's not really entirely for me, but that I'm glad I have a little bit of access to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have a good anecdote about this, because when I was growing up, I always thought there was this kind of magical, a bit like Camelot, some sort of magical city called Shaltador. Was really convinced. I can never find it in any book. So it was a bit mysterious. And then when I was about, 19 or 20, I was reading, or maybe a bit younger, I'm not sure. I was browsing through a poetry anthology, and I found Richard Lovelace's poem, Tulu Castor, on going to the wars. It's a Cavalier poet from the 1640s, 1650s. It is a perfect poem. And I can probably say it. It goes like this. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now, I chase the first foe in the field, but with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more. And I read this poem and I realised that I knew it. I had it completely in my head already. And also that my father, whenever he said it, had always said, wrongly, as you two shalt adore. And that's where the magical city came from. So obviously I was listening to it as a very, very small child with really essentially no understanding of the actual meaning of the words, but with a kind of visceral reaction to the magic of this perfect lyric. So it was when I found this poem, and it was in my head, the whole thing was in my head, but with this version, this Shaltador version.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It is lovely. I mean, he has several really good poems, but I think that probably is the most perfect of them. Whatever you think of the sentiment, I might not agree with the sentiment, but with my own children too, I found it. Yeah, it's you're quite right. It's very interesting to see what strikes home with them and what doesn't, and what works. And there was a good conversation with this, I think, with Joseph Conlon in one of the comments to one of the Substack pieces, his kind of him reading to his children as well. A few years ago, it was just before we left England, so we were still in England, so it was a few years ago, and I'd been having a kind of long-running, not argument, but debate with my husband about what telly it was appropriate for the children to watch. He thought I was a bit too conservative about that. I should be more relaxed about them watching violent films and things. So I was aware that perhaps I was kind of overly cautious about it. And then one evening they had bunk beds, the two boys at that stage. They were in these two bunk beds. And I said to them, the highwayman, Alfred Noyes' Highwayman, I don't know if you know that poem. Highwayman came riding. Highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. It's a long kind of narrative poem. Oh, it's a brilliant poem. It's an amazing poem. And at the end, the king's soldiers come to the inn. The highwayman has been betrayed by the person that also loves the innkeeper's daughter, as he does. And so he's betrayed, and the king's soldiers come and they tie the innkeeper's daughter in front of the window with a gun under her breast, because she's the bait to catch him. He's going to come back to see her. And when she hears, she's straining to listen, clock, clock, she's straining to hear the hooves. And as soon as she hears the hooves, she fires the gun and kills herself and warns him with her death, although they catch up as well. So I embarked on this poem, saying this poem to the children because it's a wonderful poem. And, I did think, goodness, it's quite, it's perhaps a little bit upsetting, but, if it's fine for them to watch these violent films, it's surely fine to listen to this poem. And then at the end of the poem, just when I got to the end, my younger son, Felix, burst into tears when he realised that she was dead. And my older son, Joseph, who's just come back from school a little earlier than I expected, leant over the top bunk and said, "Mummy, I don't think that was appropriate for us."
Let us do something wholesome, like watch 300 instead. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, watch some real kind of some violence.
Well, I just as a closing note, because your Substack is called Horace and Friends, and you do that is a genuine theme and enthusiasm of yours. I was at a reading just the other day, and somewhat by coincidence, though there was a little bit of a causal link, many of the poets mentioned or read from or read translations of or cited Horace. And one of my friends who'd come, who was not herself a serious poetry reader, though she does enjoy poetry, leaving the reading, said, "Well, that was kind of interesting. Who the fuck is Horace?" And so for those who if I think Alice and I have attempted at times to do a kind of an introduction to Horace, but from someone who's actually equipped to do so, what would be your elevator pitch? This is a very American prompt, but what would be your elevator pitch for Horace? Why go to Horace? Who the fuck is Horace?
I would say the most exquisitely Latin lyric poet. Well, for a start, he's almost the only classical lyric poet. But what he does, particularly with word order and the combination of word order and tone, is completely unparalleled and totally untranslatable. So he is that kind of ultimate poet's poet. Everyone has a go at translating Horace. Every serious poet has a go at translating Horace, because it is irresistible, because it is so, truly, truly not doable. So that's perhaps not very encouraging, I guess, if you don't have any Latin. But he is the kind of the consummate Latin poet in that sense. Yeah, there just is an extraordinary counterpoint between the sound and the meaning. He's writing, and he was adapting Greek meters that hadn't fully been used in Latin before, and to some extent weren't used in classical Latin again, were used later on. So what he was doing kind of musically, metrically, was incredibly innovative and complex, incredibly hard to pull off. But you don't need to know anything about that to appreciate the perfection of the kind of mosaic quality of his verse. And there's also something an awful lot of poems that are described as Horatian are not really very Horatian, because he's very hard to imitate as well as being very hard to translate. So when people imitate Horace, they tend to sort of imitate one aspect only. And the typical Horatian ode does something very strange and evasive. It doesn't start where it begins. It doesn't come back to where it starts. It moves from one place and it ends up somewhere else. It's not very categorizable in terms of topic. So you might think of Horace as a kind of symposiastic poet, about sort of pleasure and drinking, or as a love poet or whatever. None of these things are really true, even about an individual poem. They always tend to move, start in one place and end somewhere else. So there's something really remarkable there too. but he initiates lyric poetry in Latin to a large extent, but also kind of kills it. So yeah, he's one of those poets that sort of makes and breaks a form in one go. So I guess you have to wrestle with him for that reason. He's much, he's greater. He's much greater than Catullus ultimately, I think, and level pegging, I guess, with Virgil, but a very different kind of poet. He's also, I mean, if you have any interest in, I mean, obviously the ode as a form, but also in how one might, this is an unfashionable thing, isn't it? But how one might praise, historically, poetry has been used for praise, often commissioned praise, whether that's sort of religious praise or political praise. We're thinking about the poetry as a whole. That's always been one of the main things that it is for within a society, culturally. And Horace is one of the main models for that. Yeah, I don't think that's a very good elevator pitch.
Well, no, but in part the elevator pitch is that he's simultaneously unforgettable and unsummarizable.
Absolutely. Foundational and yet inimitable, endlessly imitated and yet never exhausted. Yeah, all these things. I mean, he's not the only poet, obviously, you could say that about. But if you want to have a sense of what Latin can do, classical Latin can do, what the limits are of what is possible in Latin verse, then Horace is where you start and where you end, really.
That was our conversation with Victoria Moul, author of Horace and Friends. Go check it out. Some of her recent article titles since we had that conversation include "Do Guzzles Work in English?" and "On a Single Word." Oh, what pipes and timbrels? I haven't read that one. I guess about Ode on a Grecian Urn. So go check that out. Horace and Friends. Thank you again to Victoria for speaking with us. And if you like this, you can go to our Substack, which is an extra additional podcast like that. Like I don't. It's funny. Like Substack is really built for newsletters, and that's not what we use it for. But if you do like Slee Ricketts, go to sleerickets.substack.com and check out The Secret Show. It is an extra episode of this podcast every week. And often it's a little bit more, less encumbered by decorum or fear of consequences. But it is generally a lot of fun. It's also where often the second half of a conversation that starts on the main feed goes. So go check out sleerickets.substack.com. And if you have any questions for me, you can write to sleerickets@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.